Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the final day of our conference. My name is Kyle Rader. I'm a PhD candidate in theology here at the Divinity School, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou. I did get that right, didn't I? Okay, good. Professor Papanikolaou is the Archbishop Demetrios Professor of Orthodox Theology and Culture at Fordham University, where he is also the co-founder and senior fellow and director? No, not director, of the Orthodox, did I get it right? Of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center. And he is also a senior fellow at the Center for Law and Religion at Emory University. He is a PhD alum of the Divinity School, so we are delighted to have him back.
Thanks. It's very good to be here. Very happy to be back within these walls. Thanks to Miriam and Josh for arranging all this, and well, we'll get right at it here. So when I was a student here at the Divinity School, David Tracy had just started teaching his God seminars. And I remember the first one, which focused on a variety of theological approaches to the God question, had about 60 students from all over the university. The second, which focused on apophatic approaches to God, had an equal amount. The third focused on the Trinity, and we went down to 12. But I have to say that it was the best course I had ever taken in my life, with the end result not simply an intense interest in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, but deep and abiding friendships with Divinity School graduates who have gone on to distinguished careers, such as Paul DeHart, Mark McIntosh, Lois Malcolm, Joy McDougall, and others. In fact, one of the most memorable events of my life occurred in that class. David knows this story very well. When my good friend Paul DeHart started speaking on how Aristotle said this, and Aristotle said that, and after a few moments, having seen David's very confused face, Paul paused for a few seconds and pointed to me and clarified, "No, that Aristotle." David then indicated that as he was going through the metaphysics in his mind, and knowing David, I'm sure it was in the original Greek, he couldn't figure out where Aristotle had said all those things that Paul had mentioned. At that point, I was not sure whether to be sad that David did not think that anything I said was worthy of my namesake, or very much flattered that he did think it worthy, and I have lived with the hope that it was the latter. Either way, David, I keep reporting this story, which you've heard many times before, in the hope that it will make it into your biography. So the decline in student attendance from 60 to 12 in the God seminars in many ways is emblematic of the challenge of relating theological accounts of God to ethical possibilities, especially when such theological accounts have a particular religious garment or coding. The diminished university-wide interest in a seminar on the Trinity, as opposed to apophaticism, is iconic, I believe, of a more pervasive, not sure what to do attitude in relation to tradition-specific theological construals of the world. Although it seems as if the recent debate on religion and public life has had a clear winner in the sense that academic disciplines such as political philosophy, political science, and international relations appear to be recalibrating based on the realization of the falsity of the presumption that religion is simply going to go away or should necessarily be privatized, it is still the case that those outside theological circles still do not know what to make of tradition-specific theological claims. The Austrian political scientist Christina Stockel has written an insightful essay on the immanent frame, posted this past February, where she argues that although there is an opening for religion in public discourse, there remains what she calls a theology blind spot, which is the title of her essay. I also want to recommend to you her recent important work entitled The Russian Orthodox Church and Human Rights, which was just published with Routledge. Stockel argues that, quote, social scientists have to overcome the theology blind spot and have to open up to the empirical study of theological debates, end quote, but not in a way that simply looks for compatibilities between tradition-specific theological traditions and political modernity or other presupposed givens, but in such a way in which the multivocal richness of theological trajectories within religious traditions could generate insights for theory building. A political scientist studying something like the doctrine of the Trinity toward imagining new possibilities of theory building in relation to the role of religion in public life, that would indeed be interesting to see. My paper will begin with a tradition-specific theological construal of God, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that all who profess to be Christian do not necessarily accept, and that has been debated endlessly by those Christians who do accept such an understanding of God. I will begin by selectively tracing the history of the development of the doctrine of the Trinity to indicate that this particular understanding of God is simultaneously an understanding of the God-world relation. In this sense, the implication of my brief selective history will be that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is not simply a narrative description of a threefold way in which God relates to the world, but a reasoned argument about how humans must imagine God to exist in order to make sense of a God-world relation in terms of divine-human communion. I will then try to show how such an understanding of God made a difference for the understanding of virtue in the 7th century Christian thinker Maximus the Confessor in terms of learning how to love. I will then attempt to show how such an understanding of virtue opens up ethical possibilities for the ethics of war and social justice, especially as these intersect with the experience of violence. And in this sense, I hope to show how deification is about the finite human life and about keeping happiness human. The doctrine of the Trinity, where to begin? I will begin with another David Tracy story from the Seminar of the Trinity, but this one isn't funny. I remember David teaching us that when it comes to thinking God, one first has to name God. It's only after naming God that one can then think God in the sense of drawing on one's available intellectual resources towards understanding and explanation. I remember asking during one of the breaks what he thought was the Eastern Christian naming of God, and he replied, Trinity. As with so many things David said during my time here, I've thought about that answer for a long time. I have to say that I finally arrived at the conclusion that I think that the Eastern Christian naming of God was not Trinity. I would argue that the primary naming for the Eastern Christian tradition, which draws primarily on the Greek patristic tradition, is a name that David himself has indicated is the Christian naming of God, which is love. Whatever the Trinity is, its intelligibility has to do with the Christian naming of God as love, and not, I repeat, not, in terms of the social Trinity model of three persons loving each other, but the existence of God as love, so as to imagine a communion between God and the not God. In other words, if in fact the Christian naming of God has its hermeneutical focal point, the person of Jesus Christ, then God as love that allows for the possibility of communion between God and the not God must look something like Trinity. It seems indisputable that the Christian understanding of the Trinity is inherently linked to early Christian debates about the person of Jesus of Nazareth, specifically his being identified by a group of followers as the Messiah or the Christ. As is well known, these early debates quickly narrowed their focus on the degree of divinity presenced or embodied in the person of Jesus. On my read, an important point in the debate that is relevant to the development of the doctrine of the Trinity was that between Athanasius and the so-called Arians, hereafter simply called Arians, even though that particular term now is not really being used within the patristic literature. Louis Ayres has recently framed this debate in terms of what he calls the grammar of divine simplicity. As I understand the argument, Ayres is claiming that the 4th century debate was essentially about scriptural attributions of Jesus as the Word of God or Son of God. Ayres seems to be arguing that if the debate is primarily one over the scriptural attribution of Jesus as the Word or Son of God, the Arians simply didn't get it that such an attribution won't work unless there is a clear uncreated and created divide, which demands an understanding of divine simplicity that does not allow for degrees of divinity. I want to argue that the grammar that renders intelligible the pro-Nicene position is not simply that of divine simplicity. The more fundamental grammar, indeed, the very logic of Christian thought on the Trinity, is that of the grammar of divine human communion. To illustrate this point, I want to draw on Maurice Wiles's review of Nicaea and its legacy. Wiles argues that, quote, the issue of whether a pro-Nicene theology can justly claim to be superior on the ground that it does a justice to the divine mystery that a non-Nicene theology wholly fails to do, seems to me an open question that requires a lot more study before even tentative answers are forthcoming, end quote. I would agree with Wiles that simply on the basis of the grammar of divine simplicity and incomprehensibility, there are no theological grounds to argue for the superiority of the pro-Nicene position. Indeed, one could interpret the debate between the strands that constitute the pro-Nicene trajectory and those that constitute the non-Nicene trajectory as one over divine simplicity. All strands of the non-Nicene trajectory could be interpreted as seeing the emerging pro-Nicene position as talking about the eternal relation of the Father and the Son in such a way that threatens divine simplicity and hence monotheism. The importance of the emerging pro-Nicene response was not simply the categories that would demonstrate that divine simplicity is not threatened with a particular understanding of the eternal relation of the Father and the Son. The implications of the pro-Nicene position are much stronger. The non-Nicene account of simplicity is inadequate because it does not allow for divine human communion in the incarnate Word as revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The grammar of the pro-Nicene position is not simply that of divine simplicity, but a divine simplicity that allows for divine human communion, communion with the true God, a kind of communion that the non-Nicenes could not bring themselves to accept. The grammar of divine human communion is evident especially in Athanasius. I will limit myself to one example, though more will be given in the longer version of this paper. One of Athanasius' most perplexing arguments against those he labels as Arians in his orations against the Arians is the one where he attempts to argue for the divinity of the Son by stating that if the Son were not divine, the Father would not be eternally Father. Notwithstanding the fact that Pannenberg thinks it's Athanasius' most crucial insight, I never thought it a convincing argument for the Trinity. But it took a while to realize that the force of the argument only makes sense if one takes into account the shared presuppositions between Athanasius and the Arians. Among other things, both would agree that the Son is a mediator between God and creation. In order to preserve a particular notion of divine simplicity, the Arians do not identify the Son as the true God, but as something distinct from creation, so as to affirm some kind of mediation between God and creation. Otherwise put, the Arians want to affirm a particular notion of divine simplicity and some sort of communion. Athanasius, however, calls them on this incoherency. The attempt to preserve a certain kind of understanding of divine simplicity that doesn't allow for communion with the true God is forcing the Arians to deny an identification of the Son with the true God, the consequence of which is the conclusion that the Father is not eternally Father, which in the end destroys the very notion of divine simplicity the Arians are trying to preserve. Essentially, he is saying that the Arians cannot have their cake and eat it too. In order to allow for a notion of divine simplicity that would allow for communion with the divine, they must allow for an understanding of divine simplicity in which the Father eternally generates the Son. By identifying the Son with the true God, Athanasius is not simply following any notion of divine simplicity, but one that allows for divine human communion. In many ways, Athanasius was thinking without articulating what Anselm articulated many, many years later, that divine human communion is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Athanasius is essentially radicalizing divine simplicity. He is, in Karl Rahner's words, radicalizing monotheism. This passage, as well as many others, indicate to me that what Athanasius saw more clearly than anyone prior to him is that if one is to think God as love grounded in a hermeneutical focus on the person of Jesus, and if to think God as love means imagining a communion across an ontological abyss, a divine human communion, one must think divine simplicity in terms, to again draw on Rahner, of permanent and factual distinctions. Only in thinking the one God in terms of permanent and factual distinctions can one think mediation across the ontological abyss as God. And more importantly, can one think the not God as not competitive or alien to God, that is inhabitable, permeated, always and already shot through with God. The Trinitarian grammar of divine human communion carved out by Athanasius is continued in the so-called revival of Trinitarian theology. I doubt if the Trinity was ever forgotten, but what was revived was an understanding of the Trinity as the Christian conceptualization of the God-world relation. This is especially clear in Rahner, who in his important but not often referred to article Oneness and Threefoldness of God in Discussion with Islam, he defends the Trinity as an expression of monotheistic faith, but he does refer to it as the radicalization of monotheism. But what does Rahner mean by radicalization? As Rahner explains, quote, God must mediate to himself through himself, otherwise he remains remote in the last resort, and in this remoteness is present only by the divisive multiplicity of created realities which point to God's remoteness. Since these two modes of factuality of the one God in and despite their diversity are themselves God, and not something created and different from him, they must belong always and eternally to God himself as such. Again, I will reflect more on Rahner's contribution in the longer version of this essay, but is it here appropriate to end with Rahner's declaration that, quote, this we can and must affirm without being Hegelians, and it would be a pity if Hegel had to teach Christians such things, end quote. Rahner's reference to Hegel brings to mind the last theologian I will reference in my select history of the Christian thinking and the Trinity, Sergius Bulgakov. As I said previously, the revival of the Trinitarian theology is misleading if one does not qualify that to mean the revival of a Trinitarian understanding of God in terms of the Christian answer to the question of the God-world relation, the answer being that of divine human communion. And even though someone like Schleiermacher could be interpreted as attempting to give expression to something like a communion between God and creation, it was Hegel who figured out that the Trinity was always about the relation between the infinite and the finite, in which the true infinite is the condition for the possibility of the finite, where the finite is distinct from the infinite even if grounded in the infinite, and where the infinite overcomes the distinction without annihilating the finite. Bulgakov has too often and easily been dismissed as simply being influenced by Hegel as well as Fichte and Schelling. But such an accusation would not give enough credit to the profundity of a thinker who prefigured many theological currents that were soon to follow, such as Balthasar's kenotic God, Moltmann's suffering God, Johnson's Sophia God, and even the use of Marxist thought for analyzing and unmasking economic inequalities toward a theology that would liberate the poor and the oppressed. And though the broad outlines of a German idealist phenomenology of absolute spirit is discernible in Bulgakov, I am absolutely convinced that rather than uncritically appropriating German idealist thought, Bulgakov was intent on correcting it. More strongly, I think Bulgakov saw in German idealist thinking of the antinomy between freedom and necessity, spirit and nature, a natural development of the hypostasis-feces distinction forged by Christian debates on the Trinity. A welcome development, but one he thought had gone wrong, especially in its inability to maintain the integrity of that which is finite. Bulgakov did argue that the only way to understand God as Trinity was to understand God as the self-revelation of absolute spirit. The categories of essence or nature and person or hypostases were indeed important achievements of making sense of the self-revealing God. But Bulgakov would argue that a third category or distinction is needed, and that category is Sophia. For Bulgakov, the category of Sophia is the only way to make sense of the God-world relation in terms of communion, of the infinite ground for the finite that overcomes the distinction without annihilating the finite. The problem for Trinitarian thought, according to Bulgakov, has always been the question, why the Holy Spirit? Understanding God as absolute spirit, as a self-revelation of God to God's self, is to understand that God knows God's self in the other, who is all that God is by necessity, but this all that God is not actualized until it is returned in freedom and love. The self-reflexive movement of the Trinitarian being of God is neither just Father, Son, and Spirit, but it is the actualization of the self-revelation of God to God's self, and as such is God's very being. As such, it is not the empty absolute, but is the actualization in love and freedom, the Spirit, of the content of all that God revealed in the other, the Son. Now, self-revelation, it is then the essence of God hypostasized. As self-revelation, it includes all that God is to creation from eternity without positing a creation in time and space. This Trinitarian being of God is Sophia, and Sophia then becomes the connecting link to finite creation, since all that God is to God's self includes God's relation to creation. The mediation to the not God cannot simply be the Logos, since whatever the Logos and Spirit are to creation, it must be through Sophia, the self-revelation of God to God's self. Creation is the self-repetition of the Trinitarian being in time and space. Pannenberg also says something similar. The created Sophia realizing all that is possible for creation in the self-revelation of God to God's self, of God as Trinity, as Sophia. Given this understanding of the grammar of the language of the Trinity in terms of divine-human communion, I would argue that Roger Haidt is simply not correct when he says, quote, "The doctrine is not intended to provide information about the internal life of God, but it is about how God relates to human beings," end quote. The point of the doctrine is, in fact, to conceptualize the life of God that is free to be in relation to what is other than God for the sake of communion. I would also not agree with his claim that, quote, "If God were conceived as single, simple, spiritual, conscious, intelligent, and a sovereignty-free subject, this characterization of God could of itself account for God's real self-communication to Jesus in each human being." In other words, a modalist position can be understood in a way that accounts for the point of the doctrine of the Trinity, and there's no really convincing argument against it. With this observation, however, I do not defend or endorse modalism, end quote. A modalist position, as Athanasius, Rahner, and Bulgakov saw very clearly, would not allow for a real self-communication of God to what is other than God, which is what the Trinity is attempting to express. This is because modalism, by definition, is God becoming Trinitarian as God relates to creation. If these modes of operation are permanent, then they are dependent on creation, and God's being depends on something finite. If they are not permanent, then they are simply created effects. The modes of operations must exist eternally within God's very life, if there is to be a real self-communication with God in history. The Christian thinking on this question has always argued that in order to make sense of the God of love as communion with the not God, we must think the one God in terms of a second and a third, but in the case of Bulgakov, a fourth. In order to discern the difference such a tradition of thinking on God has for ethical possibilities, we must again go back in time to the 7th century Christian thinker Maximus the Confessor. Indeed, Maximus and Bulgakov are the only two thinkers in the Eastern Christian tradition to present a speculative, cosmic vision of the whole that is Trinitarian. I find that fact remarkable, actually. Other thinkers only address aspects of such a cosmic vision. To say, as I did previously, that the doctrine of the Trinity hinged on debates about the degree of divinity presenced or embodied in the person of Jesus of Nazareth is to tell only half the story of the doctrine of the Trinity. I used to be of the opinion that the proclamation of the divinity of the Spirit was derivative on that of the Logos, but I have since been convinced by an argument put forth by Sarah Coakley in her recent book, God, Sexuality, and the Self, that declarations of the divinity of the Spirit were not derivative of what was said about the Logos. Coakley argues that, quote, prayer, and especially prayer of a non-discursive sort, whether contemplative or charismatic, is the chief context in which the irreducible threeness of God becomes humanly apparent to the Christian, end quote. Coakley amplifies that, quote, there is something admittedly obscure about the sustained activity of prayer that makes one want to claim that it is personally and divinely activated from within, and yet that activation, the Spirit, is not quite reducible to that from which it flows, the Father, end quote. Elsewhere she adds that it is also not reducible to that to which it responds, which is the Logos. A similar argument about the grounding of the doctrine of the Trinity in the experience of the Spirit is also given by John Zizioulas, who focuses, however, more on the corporate prayer of the Eucharist rather than contemplative prayer. If Coakley is right, and I think she is, this helps explain the link between the doctrine of the Trinity and the tradition of thinking on the virtues that emerges within the ascetical tradition of such Christian thinkers as Maximus the Confessor and Evagrius of Pontus. Virtue becomes the primary language through which the human embodiment of the divine is expressed. It is embodied deification, or theosis, or divine human communion. Maximus is heavily reliant on Evagrius, who, of course, together with other Christian thinkers, were appropriating Greek philosophical thinking on the virtues. Maximus, however, was attempting to correct Evagrius. Whereas Evagrius could be interpreted as saying that union with God as knowledge of God must leave love of God behind, I know there's a debate about that, for Maximus, divine human communion was knowledge as love for God. As Andrew Louth so nicely articulates, quote, whereas Evagrius' doctrine of prayer and the spiritual life is about how the soul is to regain the state of being pure mind from which it has fallen, for Maximus, the spiritual life is about how we love, end quote. For Maximus, the road to knowledge of God as union with God is inseparable from a love and desire for God. In essence, to learn God is to learn how to love. And the ascetical life is such a training in love that involves the virtues. As St. Maximus himself says in his second letter, which is addressed to John, quote, and the divine and blessed love, which is fashioned from these and through which these come to be, and by these he means the virtues, will embrace God and manifest the one who loves God to be God himself, end quote. In his ascetical writings in particular, St. Maximus discusses a trajectory of the manifestation of virtues through ascetical practices toward the manifestation of the virtue of virtues, which is love. Virtue for St. Maximus is not a building of character for character's sake. It is not a state of being where one displays one's virtues like badges of honor. It is not simply the basis for proper moral decision-making within a particular context. The acquisition of virtue is the precondition for enabling the human capacity to love. As St. Maximus says in his 400 chapters on love, quote, all the virtues assist the mind in the pursuit of divine love, end quote. St. Maximus does not restrict himself to only the four cardinal virtues, but consistent with the Eastern Christian patristic tradition, gives a wider catalog of virtues and vices that correspond to the three parts of the soul, the sensible, the irascible, and the rational. The hermeneutical key to St. Maximus' complicated detailing of the relation of virtues and vices to the inner life of the human person and to human agency is progress in the love of God, which is measured ultimately by how one relates to others, especially those to whom one feels hatred or anger. As St. Maximus explains, quote, the one who sees a trace of hatred in his own heart through any fault at all toward any person, whoever he may be, makes himself completely foreign to the love of God, because love for God in no way admits of hatred, end quote. If virtues are embodied deification, the precondition for the learning of the virtue of virtues, which is love, then vice impairs the capacity for love. St. Maximus explains that, quote, the purpose of divine providence is to unify by an upright faith and spiritual love those who have been separated in diverse ways by vice, end quote. Writing primarily to monks, he elaborates that the, quote, vice that separates you from your brother includes envying and being envied, hurting or being hurt, insulting or being insulted, and suspicious thoughts, end quote. St. Maximus is also astute to know that vice breeds vice, that it is not simply the doing of vice that harms the capacity for love, it is being viced upon. Quote, the things which destroy love are these: dishonor, damage, slander, either against faith or against conduct, beatings, blows, and so forth, whether these happen to oneself or to one's relatives or friends, end quote. Vices produce and are such affective emotions as anger, hatred, and fear for Maximus. Throughout his writings, St. Maximus is attempting both to advise and exhort a form of training that can overcome what are ultimately corrosive emotions, no matter how justified. Also relevant is St. Maximus' discussion of the relation of images to the cultivation of vices and virtues, especially for what I will say later on violence. According to St. Maximus, what often incites and reifies a vice are images or thoughts that present themselves to the human person. St. Maximus explains that, quote, love and self-mastery keep the mind detached from things and from their representations. The whole war against demons is to separate the passions from their representations, end quote. Maximus also warns that when, quote, insulted by someone or offended in any matter, then beware of angry thoughts, lest by distress they sever you from charity and place you in the region of hatred, end quote. In terms of images that incite vice, this resistance is not a removal of the image, but a disabling of its power to evoke such feelings of anger or hatred. To be virtuous is to experience in the face of images the emotions and desires that cultivate authentic relationships. Insofar as virtue is related to love, then virtues build relationships of intimacy, trust, compassion, empathy, friendship, sharing, caring, humility, and honesty, all that is apparently threatened by the experience of vice, which destroys relationships. According to St. Maximus, the acquisition of virtue is a training realized in and through certain practices that forms both the body and the inner life, the soul, of the human person. Virtue is a wiring of the self as openness to love. Now, in the final part of my paper, I want to suggest that Maximus's understanding of virtue is especially relevant to the human experience of violence by focusing first on the experience of war. In the ethics of war, the emphasis in Christian thought has been on just war theory. Thinking war from this perspective of divine human communion can, I think, identify a blind spot in traditional just war ethics without necessarily negating ethical discussions of just war. It is very common in the United States now to hear of stories of combat soldiers from the wars of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It is very disturbing to hear the stories of combat veterans, which include not sleeping with their spouses for fear that a nightmare may lead them to physically harm their spouse, not being able to sleep in the middle of the night because of hypervigilance, not wanting to be outdoors for fear that a sound such as a bird chirping or water running may trigger combat mode, not being able to enter public spaces such as grocery stores or elevators, having dreams of mutilating one's children, alienating friends and families, not being able to hold a job or even get a job for fear of public spaces. Many of them end up homeless on the American streets, with 13% of the homeless population in the U.S. being veterans and 20% of the male homeless population being veterans. They are plagued by demonic images and memories of the war. The high rate of the experience of PTSD symptoms among Vietnam veterans demonstrates that the effects of war linger in the body long after a soldier's tour of duty. According to Jonathan Shea, MacArthur Fellow, and one of the pioneers in the United States in treating combat veterans suffering PTSD, this lingering is in the form of, quote, hostile and mistrustful attitude toward the world, social withdrawal, feelings of emptiness or hopelessness, a chronic feeling of being on the edge, as if constantly threatened, and estrangement, end quote. There are many, many stories and statistics that I could give here, but I will restrict myself to the story told on the public radio program This American Life of the combat veteran John, who was fighting with his fiancée about bus schedules. The argument escalated to the point where John became enraged and went into what is clinically called a berserk state. He took a knife and cut his fiancée many times, and after he awoke in the hospital, he could not remember what he did, and the first thing he asked was, "Did I kill my daughter?" He did not kill his daughter. This and many such similar stories reveal that there is an ascetics to war, either through the training received in the military or through the practices that one performs in the midst of war to train the body for survival against constant threat of violence. War is the undoing of virtue in the sense that potentially impacts negatively a combat veteran's capacity for relationship with family, friends, strangers, and God. In addition to PTSD, a new category is emerging in order to distinguish a certain state of being that is affected by the combat veteran's participation in war, and that is no longer thought to be identical with PTSD, even if many of the symptoms are similar. This state of being is being called moral injury, which is distinguished from PTSD in the sense of not being induced through a fear response. Moral injury refers to a state of being in which the combat veteran experiences a deep sense of having violated their own core moral beliefs. It may occur as a result of killing either combatants or non-combatants, torturing prisoners, abusing dead bodies, or failing to prevent such acts. It may also ensue even if there is no way for the combat veteran to avoid doing such acts. In the experience of moral injury, combat veterans may judge themselves to be worthless, unable to live with an act he or she committed that is never erasable acts. Symptoms are similar to those as PTSD, such as isolation, mistrust of others, depression, addiction, emotional detachment, and negative self-judgments. Again, there are countless stories that I've heard of combat veterans who admit that they are afraid to speak of all that they did in combat situations for fear that the one to whom they speak will deem him or her unlovable. In a recent New Yorker article entitled The Return, one of the veterans from the Iraq War is quoted as saying, quote, "I don't want to tell her stuff," the her being his wife. "I don't want her to know that her husband, the person she married, has nightmares about killing people. It just makes me feel like a monster, that she'll hate me. What kind of person has dreams like that?" End quote. St. Maximus often speaks of how self-love is the biggest obstacle to progressing and learning how to love. In the case of moral injury, it is not self-love as much as self-loathing that is ironically the obstacle. In the situation of moral injury, the Christian concept of forgiveness is extremely relevant. More could be said here, but moral injury points to the need for self-forgiveness, which I would argue is impossible without some sense of transcendence. Indeed, in situations of PTSD and moral injury, we see the limits of the immanent frame. My position here resonates with that of Warren Kinghorn, who in his fine essay in a 2012 issue of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics argues that, quote, "faith communities, unlike the clinical disciplines, are able to embrace thick and particular conceptions of human flourishing and human failing, and are thereby equipped much more robustly than the clinical disciplines to facilitate the healing of morally injured persons," end quote. Such a thick and particular conception, according to Maximus, is one of divine human communion that entails a learning to love. That must include the possibility of proper self-love through self-forgiveness, which is conceivable in light of God's being as communion. What an emphasis on just war theory does in the ethics of war is to fail to account for the effects of violence on the combat veteran's capacity to love self in the proper way, and to love the other, even the enemy or the stranger. This effect may occur on the combat veteran even if it is clear that they are fighting on the supposedly just side of the war, as in World War II. The mistake that just war theory makes is not so much trying to establish criteria for thinking about justified uses of violence, and I think that discussion needs to continue, but implying that simply because one is on the so-called just side of a war, that her relationship with God is unaffected. And if theological ethics is about one's relationship with God, then how war affects those caught in its path must be part of the discussions of ethics of war. Shea describes the effects of the violence of war on the combat soldier in terms of, quote, "the ruin of good character," end quote. If we follow St. Maximus, which I think we should, this ruin of good character must be understood in terms of the diminished capacity to love and to be gifted theosis. PTSD and moral injury are indeed two of the many horrors possible for the human experience. And while seemingly a problem for pastoral theology, the effects of violence and war, both in the form of PTSD and moral injury, highlight starkly the kinds of ethical possibilities opened up by a theological account of God, and in particular of the God-world relation in terms of divine-human communion. The effects of violence on the human are also clearly visible in the poor neighborhoods in the big cities of the United States, where the threat of violence is constant. One teenager who lived in a poor neighborhood of Chicago, which is infested with violent gangs, described his neighborhood as a daily war zone. He went on to wonder why so much attention was being given to combat veterans and not to people in the U.S. who live daily surrounded by the threat of violence. Related to this, one of the most difficult questions confronting educators in the United States is how to educate children in poor neighborhoods, who are constantly underperforming in comparison with children in more middle-class or affluent neighborhoods. My remarks on this particular link between virtue and violence are at this stage more of a hunch and require more research, but enough has been written to indicate that it's a hunch worth pursuing. As an example, Paul Too has recently authored the book How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, in which he reports on approaches to this problem that focus on character, such as the recent work and studies of the Nobel Prize economist from the University of Chicago, James Heckman, who recently published The Myth of Achievement Tests, the GED, and the Role of Character in American Life. Too describes how educators for decades were focusing on improving what are called cognitive skills, which have to do with such things as reading and mathematics. Studies have shown that the skills correlated with success in such things as college graduation or well-paying jobs are what are called non-cognitive skills. It is the development of non-cognitive skills that allow for the development of cognitive skills. According to Heckman, the types of cognitive and character skills that are crucial, the types of non-cognitive and character skills that are crucial to success in economic and social life, quote, include perseverance, grit, trust, attentiveness, self-esteem and self-efficacy, resilience to adversity, openness to experience, empathy, humility, tolerance of diverse opinions, and the ability to engage productively in society, end quote. Heckman also lists self-control, which would include impulse control, anger management, delayed gratification, or thinking before making a bad decision, what Robert Merrihew Adams calls the structural virtues. What they have also discovered is that the stress from adverse experiences in childhood, such as the experience of violence or the threat of violence, can prevent non-cognitive skills from developing properly. Trauma in particular can interfere with healthy brain development, decision-making, memory, and the type of sequential thinking needed to work through problems. Toe reports on findings that indicate that if a child has experienced 4 or more adverse effects as a child, she is 32 times likely to develop learning problems. If a child is experiencing the constant threat of violence in the home, the stress that such a threat generates can prevent the development of the part of the brain responsible for non-cognitive skills. Another way it was explained is this. If one is in the forest and is confronted by a bear, then the part of the brain responsible for aggression will activate, and that part of the brain responsible for non-cognitive skills will deactivate in order for the person to prepare for an emergency response. Such an emergency response, however, is meant to be infrequent. For some children living in a family home situation in which the threat of violence is constant, the brain responds as if facing a bear every single day. There's a story of a Russian saint named Saint Seraphim of Sarov, and in the story they talk about how he's in the forest eating with the bears. And somehow this research makes me think of that story a little bit differently now. If the emergency response of the brain is activated repeatedly, the brain forms pathways that get increasingly ingrained in day-to-day situations. This means that it is difficult for such children to learn reading and mathematics in class when the brain is constantly on emergency response mode. It is not uncommon for such children to have behavioral problems in school that often manifests itself in rage. Janine Hran, who is the CEO of the Crichton Children's Center, which developed the Head Start Trauma Start program, amplifies that, quote, kids who have had significant chronic adversity become hypervigilant. Their emotions overwhelm them. They have difficulty sleeping, difficulty tracking in class, they act out, and then they get kicked out of school. The number of people who are experiencing these traumas are really epidemic, end quote. Being surrounded by or experiencing violence can actually form the brain in such a way as to form such vices of fear and anger. Again, not necessarily self-love as much as self-loathing. Two of the vices that St. Maximus says get in the way of love. These vices, among others, are impairing the ability to be in the kind of relationships that would not simply allow for love to occur, but to allow for learning to occur. In response to this problem of the effects of violence on learning, the Head Start Trauma Start program has students engaged in such practices as breathing exercises to help regulate anger and enable learning, even issuing breathing stars as rewards, realizing that traditional disciplinary methods based on fear, such as timeouts, are ineffective. The program also engages in training in the community surrounding children who have adverse experiences, such as the bus drivers and cafeteria workers, in order to develop a network of appropriate response to the child. In other words, the training in the virtues extends beyond the child, with the focus especially on discernment. Using the Achenbach system as an assessment tool, the 2013 Head Start Trauma Outcome Report indicates that children who receive therapy show an improved diagnosis on emotional reactivity, anxiety, somatic complaints, withdrawal, sleep deprivation, attention aggressiveness, stress, and oppositional defiant behavior. What was also interesting about the studies reported in Toe's book is that it is being shown how proper attachment to a parent or parents can help a child manage the stress of adverse situations. In other words, the development of proper relations through the virtues can counter the vices formed through the experience or threat of violence. What's most hopeful is that the non-cognitive skills can be learned even throughout adulthood. In other words, the human was created in such a way that these non-cognitive skills can be learned no matter what the age of a person. What is really remarkable about all this, at least for me, is the connection between all that these studies are showing with all that Maximus says about the interrelation between the manifestation of the virtues and what he refers to as contemplation. So what I've attempted to suggest in this paper is a link between the development of the doctrine of the Trinity in terms of God's inner life as being as communion and Maximus's understanding of virtue as learning how to love. Maximus's account of virtue can both illuminate the effects of violence and poverty on being human, specifically on the human capacity to love and to form relationships, and can contribute to the interdisciplinary effort of understanding how the cultivation of virtues leads to human flourishing in areas such as education, or how the cultivation of virtues mitigates the effects of violence and poverty. John Chrysostom once said that even the poor need virtue, and if anyone knows exactly where he said that, I'd be grateful for the reference. Maximus helps us to understand this comment in the sense that, in addition to helping the poor in time of need and advocating for systemic change to inherently biased structures, by never wavering in its understanding of the human being as being created to learn how to love, Christian social ethics should offer the very wisdom of the practices needed to form the human being and the virtues that will allow the human to mitigate the effects of poverty and violence and enable the person to learn how to love, which is nothing less, according to Maximus, than the experience of God. I say Christian social ethics intentionally because it has gone, I believe, largely unnoticed that one of the most important theological debates in the past century has had a clear winner. In the debate over nature and grace, what has emerged is an identifiable theological consensus across diverse forms of theology that nature is indeed graced and created to be graced. The real debate in both systematic theology and theological ethics is less about method and more about the implications of this shared consensus across denominations and across methodological commitments. This debate, however, can be productive in the sense of moving forward the discussion and how the Christian affirmation that humans were created for communion with God is relevant to the human experience of violence and poverty. It can allow us to see affinities in seemingly disparate theological thinkers such as Maximus and the womanist theologian Karen Baker Fletcher, who in her Dancing with God says that, quote, hatred leads to division and unnecessary violence. It is the destructive, nihilistic privation of goodness, healing, and right relationship. Hatred is the negative power of evil. And then speaks of the Trinitarian God, who is, quote, the source of all virtuous attributes and who calls the world to overcome evil and shares power with the world to realize such overcoming, end quote. My own attempt at a contribution is that it can be relevant through the language of virtue. I want to end with a caution. This paper is absolutely not saying all you need is love. It is unequivocally not an ode to the Beatles. In fact, what the ascetical tradition probably knew a little better than the Beatles is that it's quite not as simple as all you need is love. Love is, in fact, not willed, but learned and formed in and through particular practices. At its best, the Christian tradition is a tradition of thinking and the practices, such as truth-telling, that realize love in relation to those near and far from us. As such, I'm not convinced that imagining no religion ultimately leads us to realizing all that we need is love. There can be no such thing as a traditionalist learning how to love, even given all the anti-love baggage that accompanies a tradition of thinking of learning how to love. The experience of violence also reveals something else that is important about understanding human learning to love, a point not quite explicit within the patristic literature, but more hinted at. Whatever love becomes after the experience of violence, it does not leave that experience behind. In the redoing of the undoing of virtue caused by violence, the human learning to love is not a forgetting or erasure of the violence experience. It is not even a moving beyond the experience of violence. It is always a moving in, through, and with that experience of violence, especially since whatever shape love takes, whatever it looks like, will have something to do with the violence experienced. As Marilyn McCord Adams has so eloquently stated, quote, "To defeat horror participation within the individual created person's life, God must weave it into the fabric of that individual's intimate and overall, and in the end, beatific relationship, personal relationship with God," end quote. I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that love needs violence to be realized. The Christian hope to which I am pointing affirms that violence does not make love impossible, but whatever love is, it cannot cancel out what has been done. The violence affirmed as part of one's own narrative is eternally constitutive of that narrative, even if one's narrative is not reduced to that experience of violence. The word that comes to mind here is forgiveness, but like love, I believe that we have become too familiar with this word, especially in seeing it as something that can be willed or is obligated. One does not will forgiveness. One becomes forgiveness, and this becoming forgiveness is a relationality that does not forget, negate, or even move beyond the wrong done, but exists in the midst of and as a result of such a wrong. It moves in, through, and with such contrary experiences, as it doesn't allow our individual stories and the story of creation to be reduced to such experiences. Love as forgiveness does not point to a border beyond contrary experiences, such as violence, but to a more than, in some sense, constituted by, but not reducible to such experiences. This point is important in the face of those who might claim that in light of the fact that loss and hence mourning are constitutive of the self, of our identity, that there is and can be no such thing as love. It is also a necessary caution to Christians and rock stars alike, who might too easily proclaim that all you need is love. As Maximus and before him Augustine understood so well, love is hard work. Love is learned, but for Christians it should be a learning driven by the hope that, to quote that great Orthodox thinker, neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Thank you.
I'm sure you mean that great Anglican thinker. But I am impressed by the way that what began as a fairly technical discussion of Trinitarian theology ended up being an insightful suggestion about the possibilities for healing and communion with God that exist in the presence and aftermath of horrific violence. I think that such a payoff should be more than adequate reward for the 12 disciples who stayed with their master after the crowd-pleasing banquet of theological loaves and apophatic fishes gave way to a harder teaching, one more scandalous to the taste of the crowd. And it is also an ample reward for us, who rose early in the morning on the third day of a conference, though we knew that the heavy stone of Rahner, Bulgakov, and even a bit of Hegel awaited us. Professor Papanikolaou has approached the doctrine of the Trinity from what I think is exactly the right angle, asking not how do we know that God is a Trinity, or does it make sense that three can be one, but rather, why is this important? What difference does it make? Quite a bit of difference, as it turns out. As we have heard, it gives us a vision for the transformation of human life in God, for communion with whom we were created, and who is a communion of the divine with the divine, able to fully join God's self to finite creatures in a finite world, while remaining infinite and wholly other. Communion with this triune God is both the goal of human life and the means to that goal, and it can make itself real even where the odds in its favor seem most remote. Both this insight and the generosity with which it is expressed are a welcome novelty in the discourse around a doctrine whose importance or unimportance is often taken as self-evident. This is true not only in Professor Papanikolaou's Orthodox tradition, but also in the several Protestant traditions in which I have been formed, and no doubt in much of Catholicism. But enough with flattery, however sincere. As someone who is beginning to work on very similar questions in the Latin and Anglican ascetic traditions, I have a million questions for Professor Papanikolaou. But let us spend the time briefly reviewing what we've just heard, and then I'll try to open up the discussion with but one or two of my questions. The paper proceeded in three movements. In the first, he selectively narrated three moments in the history of Trinitarian discourse in an effort to frame what is at stake in the doctrine as the nature and possibility of communion between God and the world. In doing this, he offers a corrective to Louis Ayre's influential book on Nicaea and its legacy, which argued that the controversies of the 4th century should be understood as fundamentally about what it means for divine simplicity, if not only the one Jesus called Father, but also Jesus himself is God in some meaningful sense. This certainly was part of it, but Professor Papanikolaou has convincingly argued that Athanasius's main insight was that if the Son who mediates creation and God is not God, then he too would stand in need of mediation, no doubt by something else which stands in need of mediation, and so forth ad infinitum. He finds similar concerns motivating the Trinitarian revival of the 20th century, reading Rahner and Bulgakov in the same light. I was pleased by the way he acknowledged Rahner's and especially Bulgakov's debt to Hegel and the German idealist tradition. Depending on the circles in which one runs, tracing something's influences to post-Enlightenment German thought can be either a way to establish its intellectual legitimacy or to prove with a mere gesture that it is tainted beyond redemption. Either way, it ends the conversation. Papanikolaou refreshingly allows Hegel to have had an insight, one that is neither better nor worse for having been thought by him, but one that could be corrected and employed by Bulgakov in order to understand why God must be not only Father and Son, but also Holy Spirit, in order to be in communion with the world without abolishing the world's finitude. From there, we proceed to the second section, in which Professor Papanikolaou shows how the virtue ascetic of Maximus the Confessor is rooted in this understanding of the Trinity. For Maximus, the human being is called into full participation in the divine communion of the Trinity, which is called theosis or deification in the Orthodox tradition. I am not an expert on Orthodox ascetic theory, and indeed my expertise in Western ascetic theory is a work in progress. But I was greatly assisted in my understanding of Maximus by the definition of virtue in terms of theosis. Virtue is embodied theosis, or deification. If I understand correctly, these virtues are activated by God through ascetic practice, whereby one opens one's body and soul to God's transforming presence. Virtues are a training for love, the virtue of virtues. I particularly appreciate the phrase, virtue is a wiring of the self as openness to love. As something that is embodied, the cultivation of virtues is helped or hindered by one's conditions, which may include the vices of others to which one reacts with anger or hatred, but all the more so by the violence that one has suffered or perpetrated, which brings us to the final movement of the paper, where I believe that Professor Papanikolaou is really treading new and exciting ground and applying the theological and ascetic insights of the Orthodox tradition to questions dear to my own heart. The experience of violence is an ascesis, whether active in the case of the soldier training for combat, or passive in the case of the child who adapts to a violent environment. It forms the body and the soul in ways which not only inhibit the cultivation of loving communion with God, but even of flourishing as a human being in society. One's very nerves become wired so as to respond to constant threat, which is incompatible with loving intimacy. Professor Papanikolaou notes a similarity between the bodily practices that have been successfully taught to some children of violent circumstances to those of the virtues prescribed by Maximus. The empirical research he cites shows that even the most wounded human beings have a capacity to be rewired, as it were. The ascetic cultivation, or perhaps counter-ascetic even cultivation of virtue, does not undo the horrors that one has experienced, but it keeps them from defining a person or the world. The work in the first two sections of the paper on the point of the doctrine of the Trinity and the virtue theory of Maximus can be seen, I think, as a theological explanation in the Orthodox tradition of why this is the case, and perhaps suggest a way to make ascetic theology understandable to a public to whom its concepts are foreign and often off-putting. I, for one, plan to incorporate this discussion into my own preaching. It also begins to open up the Orthodox ascetic tradition to questions of social justice, which I think is its biggest contribution. This is also a point on which I would like to put a couple questions to Professor Papanikolaou. Because I work on similar themes and problems, these are both burning questions for me, and if either he or one of you has an answer to either or both, it would make my morning. My questions concern the limitations of virtue ethics. First, is there not something rather aristocratic about virtue? When the most influential virtue ethic ever was formulated by Aristotle, the other Aristotle that is, it was explicitly framed as a quality of those who had the good fortune to be free Greek men who were well socialized in good families. In fact, he says in the Nicomachean Ethics that if you happen to be such a person, you don't really need his instruction on the topic. And if you don't happen to be such a person, his instruction isn't going to help you anyway, not that this stops him from composing 10 books on the subject. The Christian version, as this Aristotle explains it through Maximus, allows virtue to be cultivated by anyone through divine aid. Part of his contribution in the final section is to democratize virtue even further. Even the most broken combat veteran and the most abused child can still learn it. But is there an element of paternalism here? Are we asking the poor to learn the habits of the better off in order to remake them in our own image? The Trinitarian material is a help here, as it grounds the goal of asceticism not in the Greek aristocrat or the high-achieving American, but in the being of God. Still, in asking the poor to cultivate character, are we denying or overlooking a power that they already have by virtue of God's solidarity with them, and perhaps not hearing something that they already have to tell us? Is there some way to theologically validate survival and the struggle for survival in the context of the Christian ascetic virtue theory? The second question concerns systemic injustice. Does a virtue ethic offer sufficient resources to respond to systemic injustice? In this age, the children of darkness are wiser than the children of light, and even the words and actions of virtuous people are often co-opted to serve the prince of this world. As an ascetic theologian myself, I am sure that the prayerful cultivation of love is part of the needed response to injustice, and Professor Papanikolaou has offered some hints as to how it might work, but I would like to hear more. I ask these questions from purely selfish motives, as they are important for my own work, and I'm not sure how to answer them. In summary, Professor Papanikolaou has given us a Trinitarian theological account of God and shown us what ethical and ascetic possibilities it opens up. Because God is love and loving communion, God is able to draw even the most wounded and broken among us into God's self, integrating what we are and have been into what God is. The account is novel and insightful, and I look forward to the published version. So thank you, Professor Papanikolaou, and thank you, gentle hearers.
You do. I just want to respond to your really insightful questions, and I think on the question of sort of the elitism of virtue ethics, I'm not convinced by that, because I think it could be kind of a reverse classism in some sense to think that somehow this is only possible for those particular kinds of. I do find it interesting in some sense to think about why in certain socioeconomic contexts something like temperance is more possible. And the reasons why something like temperance seems to be kind of fostered and allows for learning in ways that it can't. But I'm not convinced that somehow it's a paternalism to kind of reverse it, to kind of say that, well, can we really expect this those coming from a poor neighborhood? And then the second thing is the relation between systemic change and virtue. I've been thinking about that question a lot, and it strikes me that whatever systemic change people are fighting for, it's usually to kind of create structures which would allow for formations of character. It would be, that's what structures do. Structures form character in particular kinds of ways. So I just think that rather than seeing this kind of divide between formation of virtue and systemic kind of structures, there's always an inherent link. And there's never not a kind of context within which somehow we're not being formed with particular kinds of virtues or vices. So I think, in other words, the goal for one of the goals of systemic change, I think, is to allow for a particular kind of character formation.
What's about the questions?
I really appreciated both your questions and your concrete detail about PTSD and other traumatic, the effects of other traumatic and violent contexts. But I guess I really want to press the question a little bit that Kyle raised, which is, I myself think, having from pastoral experience and watching people who've been through these things, I'm skeptical that much virtue formation is really very possible. It's not as if you can suddenly put people in a training program and get them started building up the standard panoply of virtues. And so it seems to me theologically very important that there be a way that people can be able to be drawn into God's love and somehow show forth God's love, even in certain kinds of distortion. I think of, when I think of virtue theory, I think of, well, these are the features it takes to be a fine human being. And it seems to me that some of the things that you so eloquently described show that you can be put beyond becoming a fine human being before you die, pretty much. But that doesn't mean you can't be somehow a saint. And yeah, I guess I just wonder, even just thinking about the desert fathers and mothers, they weren't trying to become fine human beings. They bent themselves out of shape all kinds of weird ways, because all they were caring about was to be on fire with the love of God. And so I'm wondering if there's some kind of...
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to shift, thinking about virtue, let's say, in a monastic setting, and seeing it in these kinds of other, more extreme kinds of areas. In other words, the idea of divine community theosis, I'm always challenged by the question of what does it look like? And not simply what it looks like in terms of the sort of the saint starving in a forest eating the bear, but what does it look for people who start to come, your wonderful word, the hordes. And I think that first of all, I think the language of virtue can shed a light, right? So in some sense, there's some kind of theological kind of light on what the ascesis of war, let's say, really does to the human condition, in some sense, right? In some sense, it really is a kind of impairing of relationality, in that sense, love, and in that sense, really, what I'm calling divine communion and theosis, right? But then, it also occurs to me that the kinds of practices, so really, someone who's suffering from something like PTSD, even perhaps even moral injury, the kinds of practices one is engaging in is a kind of character formation. I don't think it's a kind of character formation like the saints of the deserts or the monks in the monasteries or that kind of thing, right? So I think that there's going to be a different kind of embodying of the divine presence than there might be for someone who's not suffering those kinds of experiences. So in some sense, I don't think we can, I'm not trying to expect the one who suffers from PTSD to have the fervent desire for love of God. I guess I'm trying to I think the language of virtue and the practices which that someone who suffers from that, and you have more experience because you have dealt with this passion in a way that I haven't. But the kinds of practices, right, that someone is engaging there is really allowing that human again, both to experience and to experience love, being loved and loving. And in that sense, I think that embodied kind of experience, even in the midst and through those kinds of contrary experiences, is something I would still name, what's called well, Maximus is interesting. He doesn't really think virtue is acquired. Maximus thinks virtue is manifested. He thinks that virtue is not something which he thinks virtue is something already kind of written into nature. And in that sense, what Maximus would say in some sense is those kinds of practices would simply allow that kind of embodiment of the presence of God to kind of shine forth again in a way that these kinds of contrast experiences, the horrors, have ultimately simply covered over.
But the ascesis that you mentioned, that the soldiers go through, seems like it's a kind of counter virtue.
For war, although there are virtues there, which is interesting is that for war and combat, there are virtues that are usually being formed in some form.
That's right.
What I'm calling is the counter ascesis after war.
Yes.
I would call it a form of virtue formation, even if it doesn't have this goal of having kind of love of God.
Virtue seems to be, I mean, word through says, oh, it's power. And part of what you seem to see in these kinds of cases is a kind of lack of power to make contact with people and to give and receive love.
And I guess
so that's why I find the theosis sounds good to me, but virtue doesn't sound so plausible.
Okay.
Question over here. I have a question. Christy, thank you very much for the illuminating and pointed presentation. I need some help, not being part of the Orthodox tradition. I want you to answer something both in terms of Maximus and yourself that relates to this intriguing notion of the relationship between a cosmic communion and ethics. What, in the understanding of Maximus or yourself, is God as passive or active? If the communion in its cosmic is active love, God still seems to wait or allow perversion.
Right.
So what is the relationship between the activity of love, which is cosmic, and the waiting?
The perversion of the words. Maximus doesn't speak to that, I think, at least the stuff that I've read. I mean, I think he would probably follow the basic line that has something to do with the good being sort of the absence of being. I mean, evil being sort of the absence of the good, or the absence of being, or the diminishment of being in some sense, right? So not something that's a real thing, in a way, but simply sort of the progressive, diminishing absence of the good or being. I can only answer personally, in some sense, what I think the answer to that is. I mean, this isn't necessarily a theodicy, as much as it is perhaps a description, I guess, in a way. That I think the language of theosis and communion actually helps to kind of, again, sort of respond to that question in a way that I don't think that in the end, I mean, I think what God has created, how God has sort of structured everything is for a kind of free response to God's love. But by free, I mean, not simply I have decided, but it's one that really does struggle through the perversions and the horrors in such a way that one can kind of see through both as experiencing God's love and both experiencing love for God and for others and so forth. In that sense, by freedom I mean it's kind of your own, right? It's kind of one sort of, takes ownership of it in a sense.
Where does grace fit in?
Well, I think grace fits in the sense that I don't think we could arrive at that form of love without some help, right? And I also think grace fits in the sense of forgiveness. I think it's fascinating how even if and here it raises the question of why you why you need God. or whether in fact theological accounts of God opens certain possibilities, any kind of ethical possibilities. But I think even what's fascinating is that even if one even if one believes in the non-existence of God, forgiveness is somehow wired into the fabric of the universe in ways that both can move, that allows one to move in and through particular kinds of horrors, right? Without necessarily being reduced to them. And I think that's the great cosmic mystery, is that there are perversions and horrors, but that somehow there can be modes of being that don't allow reducibility to those. They don't really have a final say. And that's not really a theodicy, I think, in some sense. I just think that it points to a power and a grace that allows in a quite amazing way, new forms of intimacy and trust to form in and through. In other words, you couldn't even imagine how these kinds of intimacy, trust, bonds could have formed without this. But I say all that without trying to say that violence is necessary for progress.
Thank you very much. Is it good to say that for Maximus, as for Augustine, right, there's, and for Dante, right, we bring Dante in because Dante has the virtues.
I don't know that.
But there is this, that Professor Fisher's question, that there is a way in which misdirected love or curved-in love is what blocks that, let's say, that cosmic love. And coming back to your comments on the ethicist question of, today we only start with self-love. That's our biggest concern, is to love ourselves. And for Maximus and Augustine, self-love is only the final result.
Proper self-love in some sense.
Yes,
Right. Yeah, I think, but I also think I want to be careful because the thing I'm trying to point to in some sense is that no matter what we do, there are things that happen to us that can really kind of affect how we, in ways that we don't want, how we can sort of relate to other human beings and relate to God. And I think that in terms of the self-love part, and maybe we're saying the same thing, but I think I'm more and more convinced that the real human problem is not, and perhaps this gets to the language of finitude, but the real human problem is not self-love, it's self-loathing. We are like, from the get-go, immediately aware of our limits, of our finitude, of that we need others. And that can create a sense of comparison, that can create a sense of lack of self-worth, all kinds of projections and masks, and how to overcome the finitude, and so on and so forth. So in a way, again, I'm pointing to finitude as a problem, not something to be negated though, but a proper sense of embodying finitude, I think which is what the virtues allow for, and which is a kind of an overcoming of a certain self-loathing, and a true acceptance of one's limits and finitude. Yeah, go ahead.
But why do you need a tasting element? Or can you only do this if you have God? Or can you do this without a tasting element?
That's another question. It's a larger question. I mean, the thing it seems like I'm trying to evade the question in some sense. Maybe we can open it for a larger discussion. But whether you think of love and forgiveness without the Trinity, I don't think I'm necessarily arguing that. I think I'm arguing that in some sense, Christians were basically saying this is the God, right? And in some sense, having something to do with God. And I think that pointing started a chain of thinking, crisscrossing with various other traditions, of course, right? In a way that I think led to a kind of insight that there's something we need to radicalize here in order to account for, again, the Anselmian point, that than which nothing greater can really be thought, I think. I do think Trinitarian thinking, I think the account of participation, both in the East and the West, did start going in the language of being an act, right? And like essence energy. And in a way, I do kind of think, both in East and West, there was a kind of forgetfulness that the distinctions were made as ways for accounting for the community. And so whether you can have other concepts of God or other ways of thinking God, or you don't need God, that's another question of discussion.
So taking about what you did, I wish I knew Max better. Try to learn to like It's difficult.
Yeah,
I have read them. But what I want to ask is that something that fascinates me about virtues, after all, the cardinal virtues at least, to include justice. Right? Justice happens virtue. But the ancients, Plato and Aristotle, and the Stoics, they all developed civic virtues, not only personal and interpersonal virtues, and I've always been fascinated in my beloved Plotinus. By the time of the empire, there's no polis left. So the development of civic virtues is like, now the Christians, I think with the Cappadocians after all were building hospices, were dealing with structural issues, not just personal or interpersonal virtues, but as a liberation. Political theologians have taught us all that you have to have structural analysis for virtue. I myself think that love often, not always, works through justice, including structural justice or injustice. Augustine in the City of God had a way of dealing with it, like it did Maximus. No. I don't see it in Maximus. No. I see it with all this, the virtue line, which is though highly fruitful, like Plotinus in a way, because it's driving desire towards God, towards the good with Plotinus, toward the infinite Trinitarian God is love of Maximus. But unlike the Cappadocians, unlike Augustine, I don't see the civic virtues develop. And that would be, and therefore the structural issues, and that would be a lack, would it not, in our situation?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think, yes and no, because I think Maximus wrote the stuff on the virtues early in his career when he was still in Constantinople. Then he went to North Africa, and it was really, it's kind of ironic in a way. He was only in North Africa then, right around where Augustine is. And it's really, it would be remarkable, that no one has made this connection, but it really would be remarkable if he didn't, he wasn't aware of Augustine's thought, but we haven't been able to really kind of make that knowledge or prove it. And the other connection too, which I find very fascinating, is even though he doesn't, Maximus doesn't have the acquired infused distinction. He does not have it. And it could be because, you know, he wasn't pressed with a question that perhaps led to that particular kind of distinction, the way it did with Aquinas perhaps. I'm not sure, but it is interesting that he does have a very theoretical, structured sense of the virtues in relationship to the soul, which of course he inherited from the Greeks and the Agnostics. But it makes me think of a link between Maximus through John of Damascus to Aquinas in ways that I think Aquinas would be much more Pythagorean than we might have anticipated. But the sense that, the idea that there's no civic virtues, you're correct. He's never thinking about it in relation to the polis, because it's always within the confines of the monastery.
Yes.
But and I'm sure you're not suggesting this at all, but I would just want, I'd be a little bit hesitant to say that because it's in the confines of the monasteries, it's not something which we can think about in terms of relationship with the polis as well, because I actually do think that these things are all kind of interrelated in some sense. In other words, if in fact, you know, there's a certain kind of evidence that adverse experiences, violence, have something to do with the development of non-cognitive skills, and the development of non-cognitive skills has something to do with the ways in which both structures are set up that allow that to happen, but also forming citizens in such a way that doesn't allow for a kind of restructuring of the systemic violence. And I think that there's a sense in which there's ways in which you can think with Maximus towards those particular kinds of civic virtue.
I was asking partly because with the Cappadocians, as clearly it is.
But that's,
the monastery is also the occasion for social justice in society. There's hospices, they're getting the homeless, and Macrina does, Basil does, and Gregory and this and that. So I was wondering if that aspect of the tradition influenced Maximus in his monastery. I never think for a moment that if you're in a monastery, you're stuck right. The Cappadocians proved the riddance.
From what I've read, I don't know. The only thing I can think of, and I'm sure you've already thought of this, the only thing I can think of is that the Cappadocians lived during the transition of the empire, and Maximus was living during a time when it was already settled. And I think that, in that sense, the Cappadocians were really trying to forge Christian conceptions of virtues in ways that differentiated them from the already present and still very much there pagan Greek philosophers and that kind of thing. So they were trying in many ways forge a different Christian sense of civic virtue in ways that Maximus perhaps didn't seem like it was really the main problem. In a way, it's similar, he wasn't necessarily faced with the problem that necessitated the acquired versus infused virtue that seemed to kind of come later.
Right. This will probably have to be our last question. I'm instructed to go with you.
My question is, how do you avoid that this idea of cosmic God blurs three very important distinctions? One, the distinction between creator and creation. The second, the distinction between the inert violence of all natural life and the vicious violence that you illustrated in many examples. And third, the difference between eternity and what Hegel calls bad infinity.
I think we only have 30 seconds, so I can't.
You won't believe how long that 30 seconds is.
I can answer the first one fairly quickly in the sense that although perhaps it's the idea of cosmic love, although perhaps in terms of the blurring of the distinction, it's at the heart of the Trinitarian doctrine of justice. In other words, you may not agree with this response, but that's exactly what they're trying to work out. And I find Bulgakov amazing, bold, brave in some sense, saying, wait, we need a fourth. We need Sophia that really thinks this through in a way that he thinks has resolved the problem, right? So I'm more interested not so much in the fact that like Bulgakov has definitely resolved the problem. I don't necessarily think that. I just find it fascinating the way that around that time, philosophical and Christian thinkers started to be back in tune with the fact that this is what the doctrine is really trying to do, trying to make sense of this distinction. So it may not work, but that's what the doctrine is trying to do. It's trying to preserve the distinction in a way that conceptualizes God in terms of certain kinds of distinctions. So that's the first one. The second one, I don't know how to answer the question of natural violence. I have to admit, I just have to kind of just say it. I don't know. I haven't really thought it through. So it ultimately, in some sense, continues to pose a challenge to this particular Christian sort of, because in many ways it does only seem to point, let's say, towards the human cause, let's say, the human kind of initiation of violence, right? And the third one, are we out of time yet? The third one is, all I can say is that it's a very good question. That's something that I need to think more on. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.